Okay, it is Wednesday, December the 4th, 2019, and it's about 8:31 p.m. Welcome to week number 10, believe it or not, week 10 of Introduction to Corrections, and I'm Professor Richard Wright, and I'm so excited that this will be the last time that I will be teaching this course with 11 weeks. Starting in the winter, I've already got the course. This is going to be a 5.5 week course. And the good part about it is that all students will be required to listen to the lectures or either attend the live lectures to get grade points. That's the way. It wasn't like that in this course, and that so many students had so many issues that I would get emails, even phone calls, and I would say, please just take the time to go back and listen to the lecture, especially the week 1 lecture when I covered the detailed issues about the course project. And so many students have reached the stage at week 9, which was last week, where Sunday the assignment was due. And I'm hearing from even a few who did not understand, because I covered the week 9 assignment during the last lecture in week 8. At the end of the week 8 lecture, I went over the details and requirements for the week 9. And I reminded you guys that if you look at Module 1 under the Lessons tab or listen to the long lecture that I did on week 1, specifically, not the testimony at the end, but all the way up to the part where I covered the details concerning the week 9, the course project, you would be on track for each of the assignments. As you recall, your first written assignment was selecting agency and contact person. That was week 2. Week 4, it was providing details concerning the agency or organization that you were doing your assignment on. And then week 7 was your interview. And you recall in your interview that you didn't have to provide references, but only citations in the body concerning the interview. And that the interview questions that you needed were found in week 1. And then finally, you had week 9, which was last week, where you put all that stuff together, separate section for week 2, a separate section for week 4, a separate section for week 7, and then you began to complete the requirements for Module 9, and you will have had your final project completed and submitted according to the instructions. This is simple as that. But if you don't listen to the lectures, just looking at the modules, you won't get that. I tried everything I could to help every single one of you guys to make this an easy process. And then I reminded you at the very beginning that the agencies had to be either one of 4 and no others: jail, prison, probation, or parole. And so not many of you didn't get that, but some did not get it and start trying to do law enforcement and start doing other things as well. So anyway, that's what I wanted to say about that. And so now we've come to the point where it's time for me to share my screen. And let's take a look at this week, where if you scroll all the way down, reminding you that your rubrics are located in each and every written assignment. And I encourage you to use that as a checklist to make sure you did the assignments correctly. And you can see every single one of the recordings down here from week 1, week 2, week 4, 6, 8, and then the last one will be in here for week 10. So this is one of the places. And then also, you know that I emailed them to you as well. So now let's take a look at the announcement for week 10. In this week, we're going to deal with juvenile offenders. and we're going to talk about what's different from adult offenders. And to prepare for that, you were to read chapter 13 of your textbook and review the corresponding PowerPoints that I emailed to you earlier in the week, and then complete the activities that I'm going to go over now: juvenile justice system, the historical perspective, major cases, and juvenile corrections vocabulary. And then we will adjourn after I do that. But I want to remind you that your discussion assignment, the role of the juvenile probation officer, the initial post was due yesterday at 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time, and your reply post is due Saturday at 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time. Finally, you're going to have to be sure to complete the written assignment, your state's waiver process. And I'll go over the details of that in just a few minutes, providing you details concerning the rubric as well and the quiz. All written assignments are due Sunday, 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time. That will be the last time that you will hear me say Sunday that your assignments are due for week 10. And you'll see why I say that in a few minutes. And then I remind you about my motto, because you know the story, and I want you to finish strong as well. So let's take a quick look at the course calendar. Here it comes. It's populating now. As you can see, it's pretty sparse, because here we are at December 4th. So your initial reading was Monday, your initial post Tuesday, and then your lecture today. Your reply post, you see your initial post was due yesterday. Your reply post is due Saturday, as I stated earlier. And then your quiz. I do recommend, as I've said before, to make sure that you you do complete this quiz at the end of the week, or the 8th, because of the fact that you want to go through all the material so you can maximize your points. Okay. So now let's look at next week, because there is no lecture next week. So next week your reading assignment is the 9th, and then your initial post is due the 10th, and then your reply post will be due on the 13th, as well as your written assignment, which I'm going to go over, and then your final exam. The quarter ends, absolutely no exceptions, at 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time, Friday the 13th, or a week from the 6th, which is this Friday. So the following week is the end, 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time, not the 14th and not the 15th. So that's why your assignments will be due on week 11, from on the 13th as opposed to the 15th. And that's pretty clear. So let's get this done. Excuse me a minute. Okay. So now let's go and take a look at these assignments for the juvenile offender. So your written assignment is very, very straightforward. You're going to conduct research and determine what is your process in your state for individuals who are transferred from juvenile court to adult court. And in a 2-page paper, explain the options for your state, specifically naming your state and the details of how it operates in your state, and include the statutes that are involved, and then the mandate to transfer to adult court. And then you can comment about it at the same time. All right, so it's a 2-page paper, not a 1. And you already know what that means, because it's spelled out in the rubric, where you click on here, view the rubric, and it tells you what you're supposed to do. And it tells you it's a 2-page minimum requirement. Paragraphs, double-spaced. APA is double-spaced, not single-spaced. And then finally, the last part you should be familiar with, because every paper has this in it about citations in the body and references at the end, and a lot of people miss that. All right, so that's your written assignment for this week. And then your discussion, which was due last night, the duties of probation officer and what are their main duties and what's the purpose for them and what they end up doing. So you're going to provide that initial post yesterday, the 3rd, and the 7th, your reply post. Then finally your quiz, which is a timed quiz, as you already know, and it's set for 10 minutes and basically 10 questions, so you know how long it takes, all right? And there are multiple choice questions based on the materials for that. You're not supposed to have any books or materials when you take that quiz. And that's your assignments for week 10, all right? Now, just so I can get it out of the way, let me give your assignments for Module 11. Module 11, this is the final week. You're going to deal with technology in your local correction system, and you're going to do some internet research to find the latest technological tools available to correction professionals. And in a 1 to 2 page paper, and please make sure you run your papers through Grammarly so that you don't get hit with a high percentage, because I will not only take the points away, but I will also report it to the dean. It's a requirement of the school that when we see a high plagiarism count. And how a plagiarism high count comes is if you don't have enough critical thinking to offset the information that you discover from your research. So when you do your papers, the way I would do my papers is I would get the sources I'm going to use, but I would try to utilize those sources to support my statements. However, the statements that I would write would be not me substituting their information unless I had to put a direct quote in there, but primarily my analysis of the information that I discover from research. And when I put that in there primarily as my paper, then my Grammarly percentage goes down and it doesn't go beyond 25%, which is where your problem comes in. That's been from day one. So anyway, that's what you have to do. And then again, it tells you it's due Friday the 13th. And then here is your rubric. And it tells you what to do, just what I said. And then it tells you the length of the paper. Again, it's double space. And then this information here about citations and overall formatting. And that's that assignment. All right, so now let's go back and see what the next thing is. So your discussion post, as I said, your initial post would be due the 10th, which is next Tuesday, for week 11. We're talking about week 11 now. And then you're going to write about what do you believe the biggest challenge that faces correctional professionals today, and you're going to deal with that question. All right, and so your reply post, of course, will be due that Friday the 13th, as I previously showed you on the calendar. And then your final exam consists of 40 multiple choice true-false questions. This time is set for 40 minutes. You should not be surprised. And it is 1 minute per question, pretty much. And the idea is it's comprehensive. It covers the information from weeks 1 through 10, which you should be familiar with now because you've taken quizzes. You should have listened to the lectures. You should have completed all the written assignments, and therefore you should know the answers to these questions. And so, again, it's based on the academic integrity policy for the academic misconduct, that you should not have materials in front of you. You should, it's a closed book, as if you were in the room and you had a proctor there. And that's how that works. And that's due also on the 13th. So once you start it, you're not going to be able to stop the time from running. So make sure you're in a quiet place where you're not interrupted, and get this completed. You'll have one chance to do this final exam. That's week 11, okay? And so I'm not going to get into the lesson content of week 11. So I'm going to, right now, go into the discussion about the content for this week. So, again, I'm going to cover juvenile justice system, major cases, and the vocabulary, and then I'm going to adjourn. So the juvenile justice system, first of all, has several similarities, but terminology is different. And the reason the terminology is different is because the juvenile justice system is more like what I wish the adult system was, and that's pretty much the goal, is to rehabilitate or to salvage individuals. And as you should know, the juvenile court operates on the basis of a term called parens patriae. And what that means, it goes back to the old British practice where the king stood and looked on behalf of the children when they got in trouble. So now the judge fulfills that role and seeks to intervene to teach the children lessons. And so the court itself acts in that basis. You're going to find there's some differences, rights that are not guaranteed to juveniles, and I explained to you very simply that the juvenile court system is designed to be a closed court that pretty much involves the parties who are involved, which are the individuals who may be the witnesses or the potential victims, and the individual who is the party who is being adjudicated, or either that is taken before the juvenile court and being tried, with the judge being the one who makes a decision, not a jury. You'll hear about that a little bit later. So the terminology is different because we don't operate on the basis of indictments or summonses, but we begin what we would call a petition. Now, it sounds like a civil activity when you hear the word petition, and it is kind of a quasi-civil activity because the idea, again, is to have that minor to be adjudicated so that they can be readjusted and turned into a new direction. And so juveniles are, here's the terminology variation. First, taken into custody, but not arrested. Now, of course, when juveniles are taken into custody, they have the same rights as Miranda to individuals as well. But there's some variations about how that's done. And so there's cases that that say that Miranda has to be done with the permission of sometimes the parents. But anyway, the attorney, of course, is always the key party. But anyway, so when a juvenile offender is brought before by the police or law enforcement, they are not arrested, but they are taken into custody. Again, the terminology is, when you think of arrest, then you start to think of an adult case. When you say into custody, then we start talking about juvenile cases. Juveniles are detained. That's why they call the places that juveniles are kept, often trial, juvenile detention centers, because they are there awaiting the next step, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And also, you should be aware of the fact that juveniles also can post bail at the same way that adults have. But they are not jailed, they are detained. So think about what we're saying here, and that we're talking about in the most positive light, trying to demonstrate that we are here to help those individuals. They are adjudicated and not found guilty. So when a juvenile court determines that the individual commits the offense, then they're not found guilty, but they are adjudicated. And so, again, adjudication is akin to heading toward adjustment or readjustment or rehabilitation. And then finally, the individual is not given a sentence, but a disposition. So there are various places that happen. Now, you're going to find out later that based on the fact that juveniles are now committing crimes on a higher level, closer to adult offenses, that there are waiver processes. And we're going to talk about that in just a few minutes. So when juveniles are adjudicated, the individuals could either be detained in a facility. After that, a juvenile detention facility, and sometimes in adults, but depending on the circumstances. But a probation officer, a juvenile probation officer, is provided for the juvenile. And the difference, other than the adult case offenders, is, well, the same thing is that an investigation and report are ordered, what we call a PSI, and it's really not a pre-sentence investigation because there's no sentence involved, but it's the same thing. We could actually call it a predisposition investigation, or PDI, technically. And so the report determines the prior background of individuals, and then juveniles are classified by the risk and the needs based on the offenses, and their case plans developed, and programs and services are provided to try to help that juvenile. And so juvenile offenders then report to a probation officer the same way as adults, but the juvenile probation officer works very closely with the juvenile's family, not just the individual, as in adult cases. And the juvenile probation officer is kind of like a social worker or caseworker. But again, many of the same things that are there. Oftentimes, one of the requirements of juvenile probation officers is to make sure that that individual is placed in a situation, if they don't end up being detained, that they are allowed to get probation, that they receive services to help them. And there are placements like in group homes, wilderness programs, boot camps, where kids are taken out to try to get them to understand the importance of accepting responsibility, and then sometimes even in what they call secure detention, which is akin to jail. And treatment and education occur in many of these type of situations, and non-residential programs are for those where the youth remain in the home. So that means sometimes the individuals are like house arrest type situation, but they'll be required to go to school, receive any treatment for any issues they might have, drugs or alcohol, and or possibly conduct some community service as well. So while now we shift to the fact that juveniles have now moved toward committing more heinous crimes, all jurisdictions have a waiver process, which you are conducting research on your written assignment for this week to determine what your particular state has in terms of waiver to adult court. And in the process, this is when a very serious offense is involved, and adult sanctions, including prison, can now apply. So the individual is transferred from juvenile to adult court. And the issues of youth in adult prisons are many, because there are so many young people going, such as overcrowding, there's gangs because of the violence that takes place. And then adult offenders are able to exploit these individuals. So because they'll teach them bad habits that they know already. And oftentimes what happens in those situations is that individuals go from being youth offenders or juvenile offenders to years later, you run across them in adult court. When I was practicing law, I had some individuals who were youth offenders, and they were transferred to adult facilities, and years later, they ended up back in the system again as adults, this time when they reached 18 or over. And so there's a lot of states that are trying to determine what's the best thing to do, including things like house arrest, electronic monitoring where you wear an ankle bracelet, and those kinds of things, or to help. So that's how the juvenile justice system operates. So you have all the details there. So now let's talk about the cases and that have gone through the history to shape the juvenile justice system. Excuse me. So let's start with the 1966 famous case of Kent versus United States, where the court ruled and determined that due process must be provided in transferring juveniles to adult court. And so what that meant is that there was a right to a hearing, and that you have a right to face whoever it is that's trying to transfer you over. You're fighting not to be transferred over, and you're providing reasons why you should stay in juvenile court. And so Kent versus the United States was a decision that pretty much gave the rights of due process to juveniles starting then. Then we move ahead to the following year to the famous In re Galt, says that hearings that could result in commitment to an institution, juvenile has 4 basic constitutional rights. The right to notify, and this goes back to due process, the right to timely notification of the charges, the right to confront witnesses, the right against self-incrimination, that's the 5th Amendment, not to testify against yourself, and then the right to counsel, which was guaranteed in adult court based on Gideon versus Wainwright and Escobedo versus Illinois, cases that if you took Introduction to Criminal Law that you would become familiar with, especially Gideon versus Wainwright. So these are rights that were guaranteed as of '67. It's interesting, all these happened while I was still in college, in high school. So now in 1970, when I was 1 year into college, In re Winship determined that in a delinquency petition, beyond a reasonable doubt is the standard. Even though it is kind of like a civil process because it starts by a petition, the court ruled that individuals' standard that the judges should use is beyond a reasonable doubt. And it goes back with the 5th Amendment in terms of taking away the liberty of someone and possibly putting them in a facility, detaining them, that they should be, before they're found delinquent, adjudicated delinquent, the standard is that the trier of fact must believe beyond a reasonable doubt that the individual committed the offense, the same as in adult cases. 71, this is the one that made it clear, McKeever versus Pennsylvania, that jury trials are not constitutionally required in juvenile court hearings. So you see in the case, well, now once you transfer it to adult court, then it is. But while you're in juvenile court, remember the parents patriae, and remember that the goal is for the judge to step in as parent of the individuals and to help those individuals. Therefore, the court in their decision in 1971 decided 49 years ago that no jury trials are allowed in juvenile court, and that is still the law now unless you are transferred to adult court. Breed versus Jones, this has to do with once the waiver of a juvenile court to a criminal court, then in that case, if you try to if you try to waiver a juvenile to criminal court after they've been adjudicated in the juvenile court, that's double jeopardy. And it makes sense because you've been tried once, and just because it's in juvenile court, now that doesn't mean that you can also be tried for the same offense twice. Basic double jeopardy protection from the United States Constitution. 79. Smith versus Daily Mail Publishing Company. It has to do with, remember I told you it's a closed process, but the press is allowed to report on juvenile proceedings in certain circumstances. However, they have to redact. They can't show pictures of the individual. They can't use the name of that individual. They use Doe, or they'll use a pseudonym rather than the actual name of individuals. Remember, the key thing in the juvenile justice system is to protect the juvenile from public scrutiny. 1982, Eadings versus Oklahoma, another landmark case where the courts decided, and this is changed, but I'm just giving you the history of it. Remember, a defendant's youthful age is considered as a mitigating factor to determine whether or not to apply the death penalty. And that's just for history. That's the way it was in 1982. But we're going to fix that in just a little bit with another Supreme Court case. So let's move on here. In Shaw versus Martin, preventive pretrial detention of juveniles is allowed under certain circumstances. In other words, that individual is not given bail under certain circumstances, same way as in adult courts. Moving right along. Okay, we get back to the death penalty. Thompson versus Oklahoma, minimum age is set at 16. Now, this is the way it was in that state, and it stayed that way throughout many jurisdictions. Prior to 88, and I represented, prior to 2005 rather, I represented individuals who were, one individual in particular, who committed an offense at the age of 17. But by the time the case went to trial and he was adjudicated, he rejected the offer that I had negotiated for him that would have helped him. Rather than to sentence that individual to the death penalty, which existed at that time in Illinois, the most that the state could get and the most that the judge could sentence that individual to is natural life. And that meant what it said. So that was the way it was. Of course, though, in, I want to say, 2012, I believe it was, Illinois did away completely with the death penalty. Completely. However, since we're talking about juveniles, let me go to the definitive case, which is law right now. And that is Roper versus Simmons. The minimum age for death penalty is set at 18. So Illinois had already reached that stage. And so now, once and for all, in 2005, all 50 states have to use Roper versus Simmons. It is the law of the land, and that's the way it is right now. All right. So now let's look at a few of these things. And I already talked about these things. These are terms that will help you, with it. So parens patriae, as I already said, is a Latin term where the kings established the right to intervene in the laws in the lives of their children. And remember, that transferred over in juvenile court to the judges. A delinquent is a minor who violates the criminal law and is either incorrigible, a truant, or a runaway. And that's determined based upon an adjudication hearing. Juveniles who engage in behavior that is illegal only because of their age is what we call a status offender. And then efforts to provide care, protection services for juveniles, such as probation, counseling, restitution. These are benefits that some of these you see in adult court, but these are also available to the juvenile court. Institutional treatment are facilities operated by the state or the county government to restrict the movement of residents through staff monitoring, lock exits, and interior. So this is the kind of place that you go to where now all of a sudden you're behind bars, and it's the same as prison, but not quite the same. Your freedom is restricted. Residential programs are programs that help juvenile offenders, like I told you earlier, group homes, family group homes, wilderness programs, or boot camps. Non-residential programs are for those who, for juvenile offenders that do not confine them overnight. They're not confined overnight. So in other words, they can go home or wherever they're set to go to. Aftercare is the equivalency of parole. So that's the same thing that happens when individuals end up serving time and they're let out early or released early, but they're still on what we call paper or under the supervision of the juvenile court. Judicial waiver, we already talked about that, where intake prosecutors or judges make a decision to try the individual in a juvenile court, and in adult court from juvenile court. And we already talked about the processes, and you're going to determine that with your written assignments this week. Social investigation report, that's what I was talking about, we call the pre-sentence investigation, is to determine the background of an individual and its equivalency of a pre-sentence investigation in adult court. Statutory exclusions, that certain states that automatically transfer offenders to adult courts for certain offenses. That's in some states. These are very serious offenses that result in that. But the statutes have been written to determine, because juveniles are committing certain offenses, that they should automatically transfer to juvenile court and not go through a waiver process for those offenses. And then that's the end of that. So that's a little bit about the vocabulary of juvenile justice. And I think that given today that you have gotten the gist of information about what it is that you are supposed to would encounter. So I hope that you guys have enjoyed this course, and many of you who will not pass this course, and there's not a lot of you that will not pass this course, that if you take this course again, it's not going to be this same course. It's going to be a 5.5 course, and rather than 6, and it's going to be a different setup and assignments. Again, I am reviewing that course right now so I can get an understanding about the requirements that students have as far as completing assignments. So I've done everything I could to try to help you. I hope that you have learned a lot about corrections and understanding that it involves jails, prisons, probation, or parole, and understanding that it is a process that takes its name from the root word, which is correct, and it is a system to correct individuals, and that's why it's called corrections. And so that's what you've been exposed to for the last 10 weeks, and by the end of this course, 11 weeks. And so I wish you the best. This is usually the introductory course that I meet many of you. I hope to see you in the future in J115, which is Introduction to Criminal Law, and also Drugs and Crime. And then further down the road, when you're near the time of graduation, the capstone course of contemporary issues in criminal justice. And so then when you get into the bachelor program, I would see many of you, I teach constitutional law, as well as I teach a course called Realities in Crime as well. I've taught the evidence course, and I have yet to teach the domestic violence course online, but years ago I taught the domestic violence course, but we have some pretty good people that handle that. So with that, I'm going to say good night to you guys, and look forward to seeing you in the future. Have a good evening.